In this section, we're going to expand on some of these ideas from life history theory by focusing specifically on a concept called differential susceptibility. The idea is that there are some individuals that carry, genetically speaking, some risk, which in the classic model would predetermine these individuals to suffer in specific environments. What research by Bakerman, Kranenberg, van Eisendoorn, and others has shown for a number of conditions, though, is that, for example, if we look at something like dopamine risk genotype, as we know, dopamine is really important in our brain for calibrating decision making, reward sensitivity, and other important mechanisms related to the exploration of the environment. And the idea is that if you have a non-risk genotype, so your dopamine system is relatively well calibrated, then you might suffer somewhat in adverse environments, but overall here, like looking at the gradient of positive versus negative life outcomes, you are doing okay, and being in a supportive environment is not actually going to give you as many benefits. But what they found in a number of meta-analyses and studies is that those individuals that had risky genotypes, so like dopamine systems that were deemed to be less effective, those individuals obviously were facing much worse in adverse environments, so harsh environments. But these same individuals also, once being placed in a supportive environment, were able to grow, and in some cases were doing even better than those individuals that were classified low at risk. Right? So the idea is that there are groups of individuals with specific genetic predispositions that will show relatively negative life outcomes if being placed in adverse environments, but will show very positive outcomes if placed in a supportive environment. More broadly, this has been discussed from person-environment interaction. So the classic, I already mentioned that briefly, diathesis stress model, those individuals that are vulnerable are thought to show relatively negative outcomes if placed in a harsh negative environment, and as the environment increases and becomes the environment becomes more positive, what happens is these individuals do better, but they won't grow or reach particularly positive outcomes. The differential susceptibility idea is that those individuals with these quote unquote risk factors, if placed in a supportive positive environment, will actually show more positive outcomes. And those individuals that are non-susceptible are thought to show relatively constant behavior independent of the environment. Right? So the important point here is that these risk factors play out differently depending on the environment that an individual is being placed in. So this leads to developmental vulnerabilities. So individuals with these risk factors, if placed in a negative environment, will show behavior that is often deemed as maladaptive, but if being put into positive environments, will show developmental enhancement. And so what is interesting with this kind of work is it builds on life history theory. It explains why certain types of individuals very early on in life are very sensitive to environmental stimuli and either become focus on or produce behavioral outcomes that would seem maladaptive when judged from our positive environmental context, but can be seen as adaptive in that harsh negative environment, so being more aggressive, being more impulsive, because it helps to survive in this relatively harsh environment. But at the same time, these individuals are more likely to grow and show highly adaptive behavior if being put in a positive environment. And the plasticity gradient argues that the more individuals accumulate these alleles, so the more alleles are combined in the genome of a particular individual, the stronger that gradient becomes. So there is a possibility for these genetic effects to accumulate and therefore put individuals at greater sensitivity towards the environmental gradient. So the important point here is that this work very nice and neatly incorporates genetic information, so allows us to understand how genetic predispositions set pathways, developmental pathways that can be activated in specific environments. So in a way, this is one opportunity of slotting in the long-term evolutionary trajectories and then understanding how these genetic predispositions can set parameters that become activated in specific environments and then will lead to individuals showing one specific behavioral reaction if the environmental cues are set towards one condition, and will show different behavioral responses if the situational cues are set to a different condition. And what is really interesting here as well is we've been talking about abundant resources and whether these can, like facilitate, for example, positive growth over time. What we have to consider though in our modern day environment is we have such an availability of food that we have to think about whether that is actually always beneficial or positive. And here's some really interesting conceptual work that shows that if there is resource scarcity, it will negatively affect development. Right? So this is what we've been talking about so far in terms of the harsh environments that set individuals on specific developmental trajectories. But on the other hand, as the nutritional plane improves, we can get to an optimum which balances the energy needs of the individual and allow the pursuit of adequate growth and also adequate reproductive success. But we have to also think about in situations where there's an excess of food, so the nutritional plane is very, very high, so there's overabundance of food sources and readily available to the individual, that also can again result in damages or excess damages of excess and reduce overall fitness again. And this is a condition that we are facing currently, where taking ideas from classic evolutionary psychology, where our bodies are now put in an environment where physical activity is relatively reduced, caloric foods of specific type, very high in carbohydrates, very high in fat, is readily available, which now reduces our fitness overall, because the parameters that our bodies are designed to adapt to within the environment have not kept up with the changes in the environment. Right? So that's why it's important to reconsider the idea of, like, what is actually a positive environment, and can there actually be too much of a positive environment. And the evidence, especially if we think about health and health outcomes, is yes, there can be a negative outcome where the too many resources can destabilize our body system. And this leads us back to, like, rounding up a lot of these thoughts and ideas. This will bring us back to the, like, a consideration of these evolutionary trajectories that we have discussed in this course. So we discussed sociobiology leading into classic evolutionary psychology, where an emphasis is on genetic mechanisms that were set in our ancestral environment. We talked about culture evolution, which liberated this kind of second mechanism that allows us to adapt to environments through cultural inventions and cultural mechanisms. And there are these gene environment interactions, which we touched upon just now with, for example, differential susceptibility, which set up very new trajectories where the cultural environment and our genetic predispositions interact. And importantly, we talked about the environment. Our actions also transform the environment, and therefore the environment becomes another important source of evolutionary pressures that through our actions is being shaped. So we need to look at genes, we need to look at culture, we need to look at the niches, so the environmental niches within which we are operating. And this brings us back to the extended evolutionary synthesis that we had mentioned at the beginning of the course, and we have talked about repeatedly, at least in passing in this course. Because this idea of bringing these three different mechanisms, genes, culture, environment, and niche construction specifically, how we change our environment, back together is really important when we think about health and the health conditions of individuals within specific environments. The classic example, and we mentioned that before, is the beaver. Through the actions of the beaver, like felling trees, creating dams, this creates an environment which now completely changed the evolutionary pressures on survival, and therefore set up new trajectories for the young animals to survive and thrive in their local environment. So it's the action of the parent generation that changes the adaptive pressures for the offspring. And so we have to look at the changed selection pressures in the environment. We briefly mentioned some of the early studies where, for example, human-generated actions like war, so the classic hunger winter studies in Holland, tracking the children born just after the Dutch hunger winter in World War II. And what they looked at was the rates of methylation on a specific gene that is related to the insulin growth factor. And what they found is that if women were pregnant and the nutritional status was scarce right at the beginning of the pregnancy, what we can see compared to other siblings of the same mothers that were not exposed to hunger, we see a decreased rate of methylation. So the genes are expressed differently, which now has important health outcomes later on in life. So it's a very early exposure, still in the womb, that sets up the body system to expect a certain environment, which now has very important life and health outcomes, consequences 40 years, 50 years later. Right? So very early life conditions, like just after conception, the conditions that the mothers experienced set the parameters of their still unborn babies and influenced their health in later life. And this is the idea of of the extended evolutionary synthesis, that the environment that individuals are in can shape long-term evolutionary trajectories. So the idea is that we can have these kind of biased or tuned plasticity effects where individuals experiencing a specific environment specifically react in a particular way in this particular environment and then show specific phenotypes as adults, and then this is carried over into the next generation through, for example, epigenetic changes, and then over time leads to a divergence of phenotypes, which was driven through, for example, epigenetic changes. And this differs from a classic evolutionary approach where, like these plasticity effects are not directed, so like are relatively unspecific or unbiased, and so we end up with relatively diverse phenotypes, whereas in the extended evolutionary synthesis idea we can have these biased or tuned effects where selection actually weeds out some of these phenotypes, and therefore over time leads to specific phenotypes that are best adapted to the local environment. This also can explain some of the effects that we discussed already, for example with the differential susceptibility, where as humans modify their environment, these risk genes now become less quote-unquote risk genes, but become more, or open up space for very positive developmental trajectories. And it's only in these rare conditions where the environment is less positive that these maladaptive traits are still prevalent. So the idea really of the extended evolutionary synthesis is this kind of reciprocal causation, where the organisms shape through their actions the environment, which then leads to feedback loops back onto the organism. So the environment is shaped and then shapes the individuals again. So we have developmental bias, we have niche construction, and this leads to relatively complex interactions between genes, culture, and the environment. When talking about health and body states, we also have to consider all of these conditions together. So that's the idea of inclusive inheritance. So we have to look at epigenetics, as we briefly discussed with those studies related to the Dutch hunger winter. We have to think about the environments that we inherit from our parents, so the resources that are available to us. So thinking about the availability, for example, of social media, of electronic information, the fact that we go to a university which requires certain cognitive requires certain cognitive abilities, and living in large democratic states, what kind of behavior is appropriate and relevant here. So all of these factors are inherited. We are not just the product of our genes, we are not just the product of our culture, but we are the product of this very complex interaction between genes, epigenetic changes, ecological, environmental changes, and the social, the cultural, the economic conditions that we inherit. And it also has an organism-centered perspective, where the effects that we experience are linked to our life history and to even some of the conditions that our parents inherited. So this helps us to understand, for example, the survival of, for example, the sickle cell um, genes, which should actually, if we think about it from a natural selection perspective, most likely those kind of genetic systems would have been selected out, because over time the the relative frequency of these recessive alleles should become less frequent. But we see very high frequencies of these recessive alleles in these populations, and this doesn't make sense from a natural selection perspective. But if we look at an extended evolutionary perspective, now this health risk actually becomes understandable, because it provides a protective factor in a specific environment. And so the implications of the extended evolutionary synthesis, the implications of life history theory, and other associated ideas like differential susceptibility are enormous if we think about public health, if we think about psychological health, so psychiatric conditions, for example, if we think about infectious disease control. And the example that I started off with, for example, about these mothers in Ethiopia, becomes understandable from a natural, from a life history perspective, because the body system of these women was set in a specific environment, and if the environment now changes, the relative energy allocation of their bodies is still set to that previous condition. And so therefore there's a higher chance of becoming pregnant. And so what this means is, if you make changes to the environment, like for example increasing access to water, to clean water, to resources, etc., which we should also accompany this with, for example, information campaigns about, for example, contraception, or more information to help women make better choices about their lives. Right? So this is not arguing against making these decisions, but thinking through some of these evolutionary mechanisms and how some of these public health campaigns can have potentially surprising side effects, but become understandable if we think through these developmental patterns and how bodies are adapted to specific environmental conditions. And so from a evolutionary perspective, what we have to do is we have to get away from this classic medical model, where we assume that there is a quote-unquote a normal body, quote-unquote a normal genetic system, quote-unquote a normal state of an individual. Instead, what we have to focus on is the life history of individuals, and potentially also their parents and grandparents. What were the conditions of these individuals, and how can we understand behavioral responses and body responses, taking into consideration those previous life conditions? Second, we have to focus on the socio-cultural factors. What are the environmental conditions that individuals experienced during their childhood? What are the environmental demands and conditions that individuals experience at that particular point in time? And third of all, we have to think about proximal and distal factors. The important aspect here from medicine is the medical perspective is very good at looking at the mechanism. Psychologists are also relatively good at looking at some of the developmental trajectories, but this has to be tied to more specific thinking about what are adaptive functions of this behavior in that specific context, and why would a specific behavior or body reaction be seen as adaptive if we think about different environmental conditions, or if we think about the body state from a longer term perspective. So these are important things to look at when thinking about disease. From an evolutionary perspective, disease is much more complex, linked to life histories, linked to social cultural factors, and linked to distal factors that often are not considered in the classic medical model. And so if you want, think through some of these ideas. Think, for example, about anxiety and depression. Could we think of potentially functional expressions that are associated with depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems that we often see as maladaptive? Can we actually think about why they may have developed over time? Think about drug addictions. This is another really, really fascinating classic example where drug addictions, if you think them through these extended evolutionary synthesis lenses, drug addiction actually can be seen in a quite different way and can become more tractable and potentially also better treatable. And there are lots of other conditions that we typically think of as diseases, and once seen through this life history perspective, this extended evolutionary perspective, help us understand the emergence of these conditions better, and also help us to think about some potential solutions to help individuals cope better with contemporary situations.